Okay, hello everyone. Hope this video finds you all well and thriving even in these strange days and times. So I'm going to start my presentation by reading my abstract just to give you a sense of context and kind of arc of the paper, and then I'll get into the piece itself. So this paper is titled, as you can see, Congregational Life and Christian Womanhood, Gender Identity and Belonging in 1950s and 60s East Africa. So Christianity was introduced to East Africa by foreign missionaries associated with colonial power structures. But by the middle of the 20th century, it had become a central feature of life for many communities and individuals across the region. Scholars of religion and society in Africa have demonstrated in many ways that Western patriarchal norms place boundaries and domestic expectations onto African Christian women. Fewer have considered how Christian women mobilize religious ideas and structures for their own purposes. Drawing on church archival materials and interviews with over 100 women, I argue that Protestant church women in 20th century East Africa used Christianity to develop their own ideas about what womanhood meant and to navigate their communities. Christian churches were spaces of discipline in which particular understandings of womanhood were developed and communicated, but they were also living communities that women helped to shape and perpetuate. So the paper I'm presenting today is a very constricted version of my dissertation's third chapter. If anyone is interested in the project more broadly or in seeing a full version of the paper, please do reach out to me. I'd be happy to share it. So I was well into my research in Nairobi, Kenya, when I took a bus to the outskirts of the city, then walked half a mile through the well-manicured lanes of Karen, a historically white suburb, in search of Mary Wanjau, who you see on the left there. Mary was a retired teacher and pastor's wife. She had been recommended to me as someone who knew about the history of the Presbyterian Church in Kenya. Indeed, Mary not only knew his church history, she had lived it. Born in 1936 to first-generation Presbyterian parents, she and her father were both members of the East African Revival. In 1972, her husband, George Wanjau, pictured on the right, became the first Black pastor of St. Andrew's, a prominent congregation of the Presbyterian Church of East Africa in Nairobi. Mary herself trained and worked as a teacher. Her life was rooted in Christian institutions, and her stories reflected that reality. Her vivid descriptions about Kenyan society and her own life were peppered with references to the Bible, church groups, and her relationship with Jesus, as you see in the quote here. Mary's repeated use of religious themes was not unique. Tanzanian and Kenyan women across my interviews drew on Christian values and language to explain their own identities, personal histories, and desires. This paper presents two related arguments about the relationship between Christianity and womanhood in the 1950s and 60s East Africa. First, I argue that African pastors and other church employees uncritically extended missionary ideals of feminine domesticity. They relied on female contributions to churches and church resources, often without responding to or really thinking about African women's own needs. At the same time, however, in the mid-20th century, church women themselves were using Christian ideas and practices to form themselves as actors who sustained and shaped their communities despite the patriarchal norms of their church communities. This dual argument is reflected in the structure of my presentation, which unfolds in two sections. The first is based largely on archival materials like teaching guides, programming reports, and church newsletters. I show that mainline church leaders expected African women to embody ideals of female domesticity and to contribute their labor for the benefit of the church community. The second half of the paper uses interviews to examine women's alternative understandings of Christian life. Within the shifting late colonial and early post-colonial context of East Africa, women sought to sustain selfhood and well-being for themselves and their congregations through weekly religious attendance, devotion to church communities, and commitment to rest and leisure through spiritual retreat. Christian women claimed robust, powerful personhood rooted in spiritual performances of prayer and community building. This story decenters the socioeconomic and political trajectories that have dominated much of African history and historiography, contributing to efforts to understand the ways that history making and community life have been gendered across that continent's past. Africanist scholars from Susan Geiger to Louise White to Andreana Pritchard have used women's memories to combat the exclusion of women from official histories of East African nationalism, economies, and urban spaces. Their analyses showed that women's labor, very broadly defined, was pivotal in creating and sustaining new forms of post-colonial identity. I show here that women's practices and views about identity were also key to understanding histories of churches, Christianity, and their impact on the social histories of East Africa. So women were central figures in East African efforts to construct and manage identity and community boundaries. Mainline churches played an important role in shaping East African standards of womanhood. Church was a consistent place where women heard stories about how they should act and who they should be. Other than schools, there was no institution in mid-20th century East Africa that had a more consistent and committed audience on which to promote its visions of post-colonial life. As Kenya and Tanzania moved towards independence, mainline churches were increasingly led by African men who needed respectable African women to legitimize their status as Christian and social leaders. The racial politics of forming new African nations required the work of African women, and mainline churches participated in that work, tasking women with respectable domesticity, which extended to household cleanliness, devotion to children, and the naturalization of effective families, nuclear families. So in the interest of time here, I'm going to focus in on just one small part of the paper, ideas about family life and composition. So Christian literature produced from mainline Protestant churches in the mid-20th century assumed that East African congregants were primarily invested in nuclear family units consisting of a father, mother, and children. Much of this imagery was displayed in programming reports, which prescribed how women should manage their relationships with their husbands and children. These reports remained silent about any other possible relationships or household scenarios, despite the reality that most East Africans were enmeshed in a wide array of relationships, from extended kin to neighbors to dependents. A Mother's Union, so it's Anglican, training course in 1958, for example, included two main sections, one on Christian marriage and one on Christian family. The Christian marriage section advocated for monogamous, loving, and sexually faithful marriage relationships. And the Christian family section focused on raising children who prayed, contributed to chores, and were effectively engaged with their parents. Similarly, this came from the Lutheran Women's Department in 1966. It's a very forced report that came out of that department after it was created, advocated that God created man and women to help each other in their lives, marriages, gatherings, and communities. So again, an effective male-female understanding of family. Another Lutheran example in 1967 was found in the diocese newsletter. So a young evangelist named Samuel Moshi was writing to address the youths of the church, and especially focusing on people who were thinking about getting married. And he advocated and framed his whole intervention in terms of looking for a life companion, a companion at marriage, that was rooted in prayer, and then looking for someone with good character who would not waste wealth and would display hospitality. There's a lot of values on display there. These lessons and interventions in the lives of East African women and young people assumed that their married and family life would primarily involve a nuclear couple and their children. Though these reports were produced primarily by African men and a few foreign missionary women, these visions of companionate family life centered on the household, extending older missionary visions of ideal family composition. So what could have been a sort of moment of development or reflection where churches engaged sort of older, actual lived realities of African family life was just kind of passed over, and older visions of nuclear Western family ideals were passed on by mainline churches. In addition to family composition, church leaders were concerned about what families did and did not do together. So to build a sort of good foundation of a good Christian home, churches invested in ideas about domestic education and programming that centered on promoting activities like eating meals together. So historically, in a lot of communities in that region, there'd sort of been a hierarchy of eating. So men would eat, and then children, and then women, at least traditionally. Whether that always happened in practice is kind of a different question, but churches had a different ideal that involved sort of communal family table, also certainly praying together, often multiple times a day, attending church. Husband and wives were supposed to decision make about finances together. That was a really regular theme, and also planning for family needs. So again, this sort of companionate, effective ideal of a married unit and then extending out into the family was something that churches were invested in and promoting and trying to inculcate in their congregants. So African men and missionary women produced most of the material related to ideal Christian womanhood in the 1950s and 60s, seeking to convince and direct female congregants that they should invest in family and church life in particular ways. While not purely functionalist or exploitative, the actors producing church narratives of domestic and service-oriented femininity definitely benefited from women's service and labor, both in the family and in community spaces. So how did women themselves respond to this messaging? How much of it did they take up or internalize? Unfortunately, very few African women were writing in that time period or producing materials that have been maintained. This was thanks in large part to their lack of education and lack of representation in church organizational and leadership structures. To get at the lived experiences and priorities of female congregants, therefore, we must work from memories and enduring narratives of female purpose that are captured in modern day interviews. So Christian women did not reject or rebel against these kind of westernized priorities promoted by their churches. They did, however, I argue, understand their role as extending beyond the domestic, maternal, and volunteer labor that were so central to church demands. Or maybe more accurately, they lived out an expansive understanding of what those categories meant. So being maternal, being domestically inclined, volunteering labor meant more than just service. It was also about cultivating a healthy self-esteem, developing robust interpersonal relationships, and acting in ways that could foster real change in the minds and behaviors of their families and partners. So in our interviews together, mainline Christian women narrated their engagement with church life as a story of powerful actors who drew not on visible or worldly power, but used their relationship with the divine to manage, guide, and protect their social worlds. Spiritual practices like prayer and reading the Bible represented tools through which women shaped their own character and worked to transform the people around them. The mid-20th century was a time of uncertain futures for many East Africans. Families across central Kenya suffered forced migration and divisions under the Mau Mau Rebellion, and people in both countries, or soon-to-be countries, participated in rising political action that would eventually culminate in independence. As women lived through such large-scale historical shifts, they were also navigating their own personal traumas, often related to partner abuse, female circumcision, lack of education, limited economic opportunities, and other family dynamics. A lot of these things came out in their stories and their interviews. In that context, church represented for many women a place to build human and divine relationships that fostered feelings of security and enjoyment. Women had their own desires and purposes for Christianity, desires that often focused on relationality, routine, acceptance, and knowledge. Christianity in East Africa was not only a matter of Sunday mornings and church cleanings. The religious beliefs and rhythms of church communities structured how people understood their place in the world and their ideal relationships to each other. So in the remainder of this paper, I'm going to focus quickly on the ways that women mobilized church participation to support their own sense of belonging, of leisure, and of power, especially through prayer. Women understood churches as places for cultivating networks of belonging. Women across my interviews expressed positive feelings about being known and even watched over by both church leaders and their fellow congregations. One story along these lines came from a highly educated Kenyan woman named Alice Mathenge. Alice was born in Nyeri, Kenya, a few miles from Nairobi in 1948. She was raised an Anglican and married into that church as well. When she moved from Nyeri to Nairobi, as a grown woman, so as an adult, she wanted a place to belong. And then she talked about the Anglican Mothers Union and arriving in the city and being given a number and a place. And I thought that last little piece there was really poignant. She said, so I didn't get lost when she came to the big city. Alice felt secure and somehow pre-approved to seek out a new Nairobi community through the Anglican Church because of her belonging and historic membership in that congregation. So belonging was really important. Part of building bonds of connection and safety with other people included relaxing and celebrating with them. Church events provided spaces for levity and relaxation outside of daily routines. Women valued Sunday church services as a space away from the constant work and potential relational tensions of home life. For example, Elizabeth Urai, who was a nurse matron at a local hospital and Lutheran, born in 1953, described to me the extracurricular activities run by a church women's group she was involved in. Called the Tabitha Group to honor a biblical woman who was known for providing for widows and had reportedly been raised from the dead. Their main goal was to develop themselves and their communities. But Elizabeth's comments and memories about the group were not confined to their purposes or even their charitable deeds. She recalled, as you see here, we taught HIV and AIDS, the Word of God, health issues were taught in the church. It was a very enjoyable thing. It was very nice. I enjoyed it. Her own associations with the group had just as much to do with her remembered pleasure in women's cooperation and activities as in the good work that they were pursuing together. And this is one of many examples of that kind of idea that church was a place of enjoyment or a place of rest. It was a very common theme across the interviews. And finally, power. So in years when women were rarely educated, minimally represented in local and national governance, disciplined with overworked domestic responsibilities, Christian women leaned on the promises and possibilities of spirituality to claim rest, relationships, and security. Their narratives about churches as positive and empowering spaces were closely linked to the spiritual dimensions of religious life. prayer, especially for the most disempowered of my interviewees, represented a form of agency and connection to the divine and other people. Through prayer, women believed that they could transform both their internal attitude and their external circumstances. So Edith Ngatia, whose quote is displayed here, is a Kenyan who works as a dentist. She was born in 1958. She described to me being trained in prayer through a course run by Life Ministries, which is an international parachurch organization. She talked about prayer as a battlefield, something she needed to develop her stamina and strength in order to engage. You see her talking about that here a little bit. For Ngatia, prayer was an active endeavor. When other people were making poor choices or did not have strength, women could sort of stand in place for them and act out a right relationship with God or bring grace onto a situation. And that was also a pretty common theme, especially when women were talking about children and grown children and raising children. The importance of prayer as a tool was really consistent. So in conclusion, religious practices and spirituality were central to East African women's sense of identity and strategies for community building. As colonialism was challenged and African Christians took up greater authority in mainline churches and society, questions about the proper form and function of African womanhood loomed large. African womanhood was shaped in the 1950s and 60s by extensive religious teachings about respectability and domestic responsibilities. These ideas were disseminated through sermons, church women's organizations, and media like newsletters. In the midst of this top-down context, women interpreted religious practices and rituals in their own ways, developing a sense of selfhood and purpose. They viewed themselves as powerful actors who employed their relationship with the divine to manage their material and social contexts. Women's stories and memories about the centrality of religious life and practices to their developing personhood shows the complicated ways that religious ideals could simultaneously demand from and empower Christian women. Thank you very much.